Edit. The difference between an ordinary day and a life-changing one is often a single detail that everyone else chooses to ignore. Emily Carter balanced a polished silver tray carrying 2 fresh cups of black coffee as she walked through the quiet service hallway of the Grand Wellington Hotel, one of the most exclusive hotels in downtown Chicago. At 26, she had learned to move with quiet confidence, never rushing, never drawing attention to herself, yet somehow always noticing what others overlooked. Her white waitress apron was perfectly tied over a crisp white shirt, her blonde hair neatly pulled into a ponytail, and her calm blue eyes scanned every corner of the corridor with the quiet habit of someone who had once studied nursing before life forced her onto a different path. The afternoon business conference had transformed the hotel into a gathering place for some of the country's most influential executives, investors, and entrepreneurs. Security officers stood near every entrance. Hotel managers moved quickly between private meeting rooms. Every detail had been planned with military precision because one guest mattered more than all the others combined. Jonathan Hayes, the 45-year-old billionaire known for building one of America's largest technology companies, had reserved the executive conference suite for a series of confidential meetings expected to reshape several $1 billion worth of investments. Emily had never spoken to him beyond politely serving coffee during previous visits. Unlike many wealthy guests, he always thanked every employee by name whenever he remembered it. That simple courtesy had quietly earned her respect long before she knew anything about his success. She approached the private hallway leading toward the executive lounge, preparing to deliver the coffee requested only minutes earlier. Just before reaching the door, she noticed something unusual. The conference room should have been guarded by the hotel's executive security officer, yet the hallway stood strangely empty. She slowed her pace without fully understanding why her instincts suddenly felt uneasy. Through a narrow opening where the heavy wooden door had failed to close completely, she caught sight of Jonathan seated comfortably in a leather chair with his jacket folded beside him. Standing near him were 2 men wearing dark medical jackets with identification badges clipped neatly to their pockets. At first glance, nothing appeared alarming. One of the men spoke calmly while preparing what looked like medical equipment. The other gently held Jonathan's forearm as if assisting with a routine procedure. Jonathan himself appeared relaxed, listening attentively without any visible concern. Emily almost continued walking. Hotels often arranged private medical visits for high-profile guests. That explanation should have been enough. Yet something held her in place. She watched silently for an off. Emily Carter remained perfectly still in the quiet hallway, her hands steady beneath the weight of the silver coffee tray, even as her thoughts began moving faster than ever before. She had learned years ago that panic rarely solved anything. Observation did. Her nursing instructors used to repeat the same lesson during every clinical exercise. Slow down. Look again. The answer is usually hiding inside the smallest detail. Emily had carried those words with her long after she left nursing school to care for her widowed mother following a difficult illness that changed both of their lives. Tuition had become impossible to afford. Hospital rotations gave way to double shifts carrying coffee instead of medical charts. Yet she never stopped noticing the little things that other people dismissed. She quietly stepped behind a decorative marble column near the hallway corner and carefully looked toward the conference room once again. Jonathan Hayes remained seated comfortably, speaking casually with the 2 men as though nothing unusual had happened. One of them smiled while placing the used medical supplies into a compact black case. The entire interaction appeared organized, efficient, and professional. If anyone else had walked by, they would have assumed everything was completely normal. Emily wanted to believe the same thing. She truly did. But another memory surfaced unexpectedly. During one of her clinical training sessions, every instructor had emphasized that licensed medical professionals always confirmed patient identity, documented medication, and followed strict verification procedures before administering any treatment, especially outside a hospital. She had not seen any paperwork. She had not heard anyone verify Jonathan's name or explain the purpose of the injection. Perhaps those steps had happened before she arrived. Perhaps everything was perfectly legitimate. Yet uncertainty refused to leave her mind. She finally turned away and headed toward the service station where several coworkers were preparing dessert orders. "Emily, did you deliver the executive coffee?" asked Rachel, another waitress, without looking up from the plates she was arranging. Emily hesitated. Not yet. Something unexpected happened upstairs. Rachel laughed lightly. Those wealthy guests always have something unusual going on. Emily lowered her voice. Did you know the hotel scheduled private medical staff for Mr. Hayes today? Rachel shrugged. I have no idea. Ask security if you are worried. That simple suggestion seemed reasonable enough. Emily thanked her and walked toward the executive security office located beside the conference elevators. To her surprise, the desk stood empty. A portable radio rested beside an open logbook, but the assigned officer was nowhere in sight. Emily checked the hallway clock. Only 3 minutes had passed since she first looked through the partially opened door, yet it somehow felt much longer. She considered simply leaving the coffee outside the meeting room and returning to work. After all, she was only a waitress. She had no authority to question private medical procedures involving one of the country's most influential business leaders. Even if she spoke up, who would believe her over 2 men wearing medical jackets and identification badges? Still, another quiet voice inside reminded her why she had once dreamed of becoming a nurse. Caring for people had never depended on job titles. It depended on paying attention when something did not feel right. Emily looked once more toward the silent executive hallway. The coffee on her tray was beginning to cool, but the uneasy feeling in her heart only grew stronger. Somewhere beyond those heavy wooden doors, one small, unanswered question was quietly waiting for someone brave enough to ask it. Emily Carter took one slow breath before making the only decision that allowed her to live with herself. She picked up the radio resting on the unattended security desk and pressed the call button. Only static answered. She tried again. Nothing. The hallway remained strangely quiet except for the distant sound of an elevator arriving several floors below. She gently returned the radio to the desk and looked toward the executive conference room once more. The heavy door opened just enough for the 2 men in medical jackets to step into the hallway carrying their compact black case. Emily immediately lowered her eyes and continued walking with the silver tray as though she had never noticed them. One of the men smiled politely as they passed. "Excuse us, miss." His voice was calm, confident, and completely ordinary. Emily returned a professional smile. "Of course, sir." As they disappeared around the corner, she noticed another detail. The logo embroidered onto the sleeve of one jacket represented a medical group she had never heard of despite spending 2 years studying clinical procedures throughout Illinois. That alone meant nothing. Small private practices existed everywhere. Yet the embroidered stitching looked unusually new, as though the patch had been attached recently rather than manufactured with the jacket itself. Her instincts grew even louder. Before she could think any further, the conference room door opened again. Jonathan Hayes stepped into the hallway alone, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored navy jacket while speaking briefly on his cellular phone. He looked completely comfortable, thanking the person on the other end before ending the call with his usual calm professionalism. Emily approached carefully with the coffee tray. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes." "Your coffee, sir." Jonathan smiled with the same quiet courtesy she had always admired. "Thank you, Emily." She blinked in surprise. "You remembered my name." He accepted the cup with an easy smile. "People remember how someone makes them feel. You always make this place feel welcoming." His kindness only made the decision before her more difficult. Emily hesitated for a brief moment before speaking carefully. "Sir, may I ask you something?" Jonathan looked at her with genuine attention. "Of course." Emily chose every word with caution. "The gentlemen who were with you earlier, were they part of your regular medical team?" Jonathan seemed slightly surprised by the question. "No, not exactly. They were recommended by one of today's business guests for a routine wellness treatment." "Why do you ask?" Emily immediately regretted opening the conversation. She had no proof, only observations. "It is probably nothing," she answered softly. "I simply thought I recognized one of their uniforms from somewhere else." Jonathan studied her expression for a second longer than expected. Years of leading companies had taught him to recognize sincerity. Emily was clearly not seeking attention. She looked genuinely concerned. Before he could ask another question, his executive assistant approached from the opposite hallway carrying a tablet. "Mr. Hayes, the board members have arrived." Jonathan nodded but looked back toward Emily. "Thank you for mentioning it." He lifted the untouched coffee cup slightly before walking toward the conference suite. Emily watched him disappear behind another set of polished wooden doors, hoping she had done the right thing even if it accomplished nothing. At that exact moment, one of the hotel's senior security supervisors finally hurried back toward the previously empty desk, apologizing to a colleague for being called away unexpectedly by what turned out to be a false maintenance alarm on another floor. Emily quietly turned toward him. The uneasy feeling had not disappeared. If anything, it had only become stronger, because she now realized someone had deliberately created the perfect moment for the executive hallway to be left completely unguarded. The security supervisor, Mark Sullivan, listened carefully as Emily Carter described everything she had observed, never interrupting, never dismissing her concerns, yet his expression remained cautious. When she finished, he glanced toward the executive conference floor before looking back at her with professional restraint. "Emily, I appreciate you bringing this to me, but Mr. Hayes frequently works with private physicians and consultants. High-profile clients often arrange medical services independently. An upside-down identification badge is not enough for us to question licensed professionals." Emily nodded respectfully. "I understand. I know how it sounds." Mark offered a reassuring smile. "You did the right thing by speaking up. Let me make a few phone calls anyway." Although grateful, Emily sensed from his tone that he expected nothing unusual to come from the report. She quietly returned to the dining area, determined to finish her shift without creating unnecessary attention. Still, every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the private elevators leading to the executive suites. Nearly an hour passed before Jonathan Hayes emerged again, accompanied by several executives discussing investment proposals as they walked toward the ballroom where the afternoon presentation would begin. Jonathan appeared composed and energetic, greeting hotel employees with the same quiet courtesy he always showed. For one brief moment, Emily wondered if she had imagined the entire situation. Perhaps she had allowed old nursing lessons to make her overly suspicious. She carried another tray of coffee through the ballroom entrance, carefully serving guests seated near the front. As she approached Jonathan's table, she noticed him gently rubbing the sleeve of his jacket where the injection had been administered earlier. It was a small, absent-minded gesture, almost invisible. Most people would have ignored it. Emily remembered patients often touching an unfamiliar injection site simply because it felt different for a few hours afterward. Nothing about the movement suggested an emergency, yet it reminded her that unanswered questions still remained. Jonathan thanked her once again as she placed fresh coffee beside him. "Everything all right, Emily?" he asked with genuine kindness after noticing the thoughtful expression on her face. Emily hesitated before answering honestly. "I hope so, sir." Before Jonathan could respond, the hotel's medical coordinator entered the ballroom carrying a clipboard while speaking with Mark Sullivan. Emily watched as both men exchanged puzzled expressions. Moments later, Mark approached Jonathan discreetly and quietly asked whether he had received treatment from the hospital team assigned to the conference. Jonathan answered with visible surprise. "No. My assistant informed me another medical group had arrived earlier because the schedule changed." The medical coordinator immediately shook his head. "Sir, our schedule was never changed. Our staff has been waiting downstairs since noon. No one from our department has visited your suite today." A quiet silence settled over the small group. Jonathan slowly turned toward Emily, remembering the careful question she had asked in the hallway. Mark's expression changed instantly from polite reassurance to focused concern. Without creating panic among the conference guests, he calmly instructed additional security officers to verify visitor records, review hallway camera footage, and locate the two unidentified men who had entered the executive floor earlier that afternoon. Emily remained near the ballroom entrance holding her empty serving tray, saying nothing. She had not solved the mystery. She had not accused anyone. She had simply noticed one small detail that everyone else had overlooked. And for the first time that day, she realized she had not been imagining the feeling that refused to leave her heart. Mark Sullivan moved quickly without raising his voice, understanding that protecting calm was just as important as protecting people. Within minutes, additional security personnel quietly spread throughout the hotel, checking visitor logs, reviewing elevator access records, and comparing surveillance footage from every executive corridor. Conference guests continued discussing business, completely unaware that an internal investigation had already begun around them. Emily Carter returned to the service station, but she found it impossible to focus entirely on polishing glasses or arranging dessert plates. Her eyes kept drifting toward the ballroom entrance, where Jonathan Hayes continued meeting investors with the same composed professionalism that had made him one of the country's most respected business leaders. Nothing about his appearance suggested he suspected anything unusual. That somehow made Emily even more determined to trust her instincts instead of her fears. Nearly 20 minutes later, Mark appeared beside the service station carrying a tablet computer. His expression was no longer uncertain. "Emily," he said quietly, "I need you to look at something." He turned the screen toward her. Security footage showed the two men entering the executive floor through a restricted elevator usually reserved for authorized medical staff. They wore identical jackets and identification badges. At first glance, everything appeared completely legitimate. Then Mark paused the video. "Tell me what you noticed." Emily leaned closer. She pointed immediately toward one of the badges. "It is upside down." Mark nodded. "Anything else?" Emily watched the recording again, this time more slowly. Suddenly another detail stood out. The case they carried. Mark raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Emily answered carefully. "Medical transport cases usually have inventory labels or emergency identification stickers. This one does not. It is completely plain." Mark looked impressed. "That is exactly what our investigators found." He changed to another camera angle showing the same two men leaving the executive hallway only minutes later. Instead of exiting through the hotel lobby, they entered a service elevator leading directly to the underground parking garage. Their visitor credentials were never scanned at the security checkpoint. "Those identification cards were never registered in our system," Mark explained quietly. "Someone created temporary access without authorization." Emily felt a chill despite the warmth of the kitchen. "Have you found them?" Mark shook his head. "Not yet. But because you spoke up early, every exit was monitored before they could return." Just then Jonathan Hayes entered the service corridor accompanied only by his executive assistant. He thanked several kitchen employees for their hospitality before approaching Mark. "Any updates?" Mark briefly explained the missing visitor records and the ongoing investigation. Jonathan listened without interrupting before his attention shifted toward Emily. "You noticed the badge before anyone else," he said. Emily lowered her eyes modestly. "I only remembered what my instructors used to teach us. Small details often matter." Jonathan smiled thoughtfully. "Most people stop paying attention once something looks official." Before anyone could continue the conversation, Mark's radio came to life. A security officer reported that surveillance investigators had located the abandoned medical jackets and the empty black case inside a maintenance storage room near the parking garage. No dangerous materials had been found inside, but the equipment was clearly not associated with any licensed medical provider or the hotel itself. The discovery confirmed one thing beyond any doubt. Two strangers had gained unauthorized access to one of the most protected guests in the building, while everyone assumed someone else had already verified their identity. Jonathan looked back at Emily with quiet respect. "You trusted your judgment when everyone else trusted appearances," he said softly. Emily glanced at the folded white waitress apron tied around her waist and answered with the same humility she carried every day. Sometimes the smallest warning is simply someone noticing what everybody else walks past. By early evening, the Grand Wellington Hotel had quietly completed its internal review without disturbing a single conference session. Guests continued discussing investments, shaking hands, and exchanging business cards, never realizing how close the day had come to unfolding very differently. Inside a private meeting room, representatives from hotel security, the conference organizers, and the licensed medical provider carefully compared schedules, visitor records, and surveillance footage. The conclusion was both simple and deeply unsettling. The two men had never been scheduled to meet Jonathan Hayes. They had entered the executive floor using unauthorized credentials that closely resembled official identification, relied on the assumption that no one would question a professional appearance, and left before routine verification procedures could catch the discrepancy. Even more surprising, the licensed physician originally assigned to Jonathan's appointment had been delayed after receiving incorrect directions that sent his vehicle to another hotel several miles away. Someone had carefully arranged a series of small misunderstandings that almost fit together perfectly. Almost. The only part that did not follow the plan was a waitress who happened to notice one tiny inconsistency no one else considered important. Emily Carter listened quietly from the edge of the room after Mark Sullivan invited her to hear the final briefing. She never interrupted. She never appeared proud. She simply wanted to know whether her instincts had been justified. One of the investigators looked toward her with sincere appreciation. Your observation gave us the exact starting point we needed. Without it, we would have spent hours reviewing thousands of ordinary moments instead of focusing on the right ones immediately. Emily lowered her eyes modestly. I only noticed something that did not make sense. Jonathan Hayes smiled gently. That is exactly what exceptional people do. They refuse to ignore the question everyone else explains away. The licensed physician who had finally arrived examined Jonathan once more and confirmed that he was feeling well, while recommending a routine follow-up evaluation simply because the earlier treatment had not been properly documented. Jonathan thanked him before turning back toward Emily. When I built my first company, he said thoughtfully, I believe success came from hiring the smartest people in the room. Over the years, I learned something more important. The people who protect you are often the ones paying attention when everyone else is distracted. Emily looked at the polished floor for a moment before answering. My nursing instructor used to tell us that details are quiet. They do not shout for attention. We have to choose to see them. Jonathan nodded slowly, clearly remembering every careful question she had asked hours earlier instead of remaining silent. Outside the meeting room, hotel employees continued preparing dinner service exactly as they always did. Emily untied her white waitress apron for a moment, smoothed the fabric with both hands, and tied it neatly again before returning to work. There were still guests waiting for coffee, families arriving for dinner, and co-workers depending on her as though the afternoon had been completely ordinary. Yet deep inside, something had changed forever. She had learned that courage did not always look dramatic. Sometimes courage meant quietly trusting years of forgotten knowledge when every other voice encouraged doubt. As Jonathan watched her disappear back into the dining room carrying another silver tray with the same calm grace she had shown all day, he realized that the woman who had protected him without expecting recognition possessed exactly the kind of judgment that money could never purchase and titles alone could never guarantee. The following morning arrived with clear skies over downtown Chicago, yet the atmosphere inside the Grand Wellington Hotel felt noticeably different. The conference continued exactly as scheduled, but additional security officers quietly monitored every entrance while updated verification procedures were introduced without alarming any guests. Emily Carter arrived for her shift as she always did, tying her white waitress apron carefully before greeting coworkers with the same warm smile she wore every morning. Nothing about her appearance suggested she had become the most discussed employee in the building. She still refilled coffee cups, carried breakfast trays, and wished every guest a pleasant morning with quiet sincerity. Shortly after 10 o'clock, the hotel manager approached her with an unexpected request. Mr. Hayes would like to see you in the executive lounge whenever you have a few minutes. Emily immediately wondered whether she had made another mistake. She washed her hands, straightened her apron, and followed the manager upstairs. Jonathan Hayes stood alone beside the large windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, holding a simple cup of coffee instead of reviewing business reports. When Emily entered, he greeted her with the same calm respect she had come to expect from him. Thank you for coming, Emily. She smiled politely. You asked to see me, sir? Jonathan nodded toward the chair across from him. Please, have a seat. Emily hesitated. I am still on duty. Jonathan smiled gently. Then I will make this brief. She sat carefully, unsure where the conversation might lead. Jonathan placed a thin folder on the table, but did not open it immediately. Instead, he asked a single question. Why did you keep paying attention after everyone else told you everything was probably fine? Emily looked down at her folded hands for a moment before answering honestly. Because I could not explain away the feeling that something was incomplete. During nursing school, my instructors taught us that when small details stop matching the larger picture, we should never ignore the question simply because asking it feels uncomfortable. Jonathan listened without interrupting. Most people worry about looking foolish. Emily smiled softly. I was worried about that too, but I thought it would be much harder to forgive myself if I stayed silent. A quiet silence settled between them before Jonathan finally opened the folder. Inside were printed photographs taken from hotel surveillance cameras showing Emily carrying her silver tray through the hallway, speaking with security, and calmly returning to work afterward. There were no dramatic moments, no heroic poses, just a young waitress quietly choosing responsibility over convenience. Jonathan looked at the photographs before speaking again. Yesterday, I reviewed hours of security footage. Every executive in my company believed the story was about unauthorized visitors. They were wrong. Emily looked at him with quiet curiosity. Then what was the story about? Jonathan smiled. It was about one person who still believed observation mattered more than assumptions. Emily lowered her eyes modestly. I only did what I hoped someone would do for my family. Jonathan leaned back thoughtfully. That answer tells me everything I needed to know. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected across the glass towers of the city while the morning continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet Jonathan realized the greatest investment opportunity he had discovered during the entire conference was not written inside any financial report. It was sitting across the table wearing a neatly pressed waitress apron, carrying herself with quiet dignity, and reminding everyone in the room that character often reveals itself long before success ever does. Jonathan Hayes closed the folder slowly and remained silent for several moments, allowing the conversation to settle naturally instead of rushing toward a conclusion. Emily Carter expected a simple thank you before returning downstairs to refill coffee cups and greet the next group of guests. Instead, Jonathan reached for another document resting beside the window and gently placed it in front of her. This is not a reward, he said quietly. It is an invitation. Emily looked down at the first page. The heading read Community Safety and Emergency Preparedness Initiative. Beneath it appeared the logo of the Hayes Foundation, followed by a proposal describing a nationwide training program for hotels, conference centers, and public venues focused on observation, emergency awareness, and compassionate response during unexpected situations. She looked back at Jonathan with visible surprise. I do not understand. Jonathan smiled. Yesterday reminded me that technology can monitor cameras, scan identification cards, and analyze thousands of records every second. But technology cannot replace human judgment. It cannot recognize the quiet instinct that tells someone to look one more time. Emily carefully turned another page. The program outlined workshops designed to help hospitality employees recognize unusual situations, communicate concerns professionally, and respond calmly without creating unnecessary panic. It was not about fear. It was about responsibility. You want me to read this? She asked softly. Jonathan shook his head. I want you to help build it. Emily almost laughed in disbelief before realizing he was completely serious. Mr. Hayes, I am a waitress. Jonathan answered without hesitation. Exactly. Yesterday you were not protected by a prestigious title or executive authority. You were protected by character, training you never abandoned, and the courage to ask one respectful question. Those qualities cannot be taught from a boardroom alone. Emily looked toward the window overlooking the city, trying to imagine herself participating in something so much larger than the restaurant where she had worked for 4 years. I have never managed a national program. Jonathan nodded. Neither had I before building my first company. Every meaningful journey begins before we believe we are ready. He continued in the same calm voice. You would not be expected to run everything alone. You would work alongside experienced emergency planners, healthcare professionals, and hospitality leaders. My foundation already has experts. What it needs is someone who understands what it feels like to stand quietly in the hallway, notice the detail everyone else missed, and choose responsibility over comfort. Emily remained thoughtful for a long moment. If I accepted something like this, I would still want to spend time working directly with people. I never want to forget where I came from. Jonathan smiled with unmistakable respect. That answer is the reason I asked you instead of someone with a longer resume. He stood and walked toward the large window where morning sunlight reflected across the Chicago skyline. Many people believe leadership begins when someone gives you authority. I believe leadership begins the moment someone quietly chooses to protect another person without expecting recognition. Emily slowly closed the proposal folder, her fingers resting lightly across its cover. She realized the opportunity before her had nothing to do with becoming wealthy or famous. It was about transforming one ordinary observation into a way of helping countless others pay closer attention before small problems became larger ones. For the first time since leaving nursing school, she felt as though every difficult decision she had ever made had somehow been leading her toward this unexpected moment. Several weeks later, the conference at the Grand Wellington Hotel had become little more than a quiet memory for most of the people who attended it. New business deals had been signed, headlines had shifted toward other events, and the city had returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet inside the Hayes Foundation, one unexpected moment continued creating meaningful change. Emily Carter accepted Jonathan Hayes's invitation, not by leaving behind the values that had shaped her life, but by carrying them into a larger purpose. She spent her mornings learning from emergency preparedness specialists, healthcare professionals, hospitality leaders, and security consultants. Every afternoon she visited hotels, community centers, and training facilities, sharing one lesson again and again. Never assume someone else has already noticed. Her words were simple, but people remembered them because they came from experience rather than theory. The new training program quickly expanded across hotels, convention centers, and nonprofit organizations throughout the country. Employees practiced careful observation, respectful communication, and calm decision-making instead of reacting with fear. Emily insisted that every lesson begin with compassion rather than suspicion. "We are not teaching people to become afraid," she often explained. "We are teaching them to care enough to look twice." Jonathan attended many of the sessions quietly from the back of the room, rarely speaking unless someone asked a direct question. He watched Emily encourage housekeepers, receptionists, waiters, maintenance workers, and security teams with the same gentle respect she had once shown every guest carrying a coffee tray through the Grand Wellington Hotel. She never presented herself as a hero. She always reminded people that anyone could have made the same choice if they trusted both their knowledge and their conscience. One afternoon, Jonathan invited Emily back to the hotel where everything had begun. The executive hallway looked exactly as it had on that unforgettable day, except new identification systems, improved verification procedures, and additional training had become permanent parts of the hotel's daily routine. Mark Sullivan greeted Emily with a warm handshake before smiling proudly. "Since your training program began, our employees report unusual situations with confidence instead of hesitation. We have solved dozens of small problems before they ever became serious." Emily looked down the familiar corridor and smiled quietly. She remembered standing there with nothing more than a silver tray, an uneasy feeling, and the courage to ask one respectful question. Before leaving, she walked into the dining room where a young waitress carefully adjusted her white apron before beginning her evening shift. The young woman looked nervous, reminding Emily of herself only weeks earlier. Emily gently straightened the name tag on the waitress's uniform before smiling. "Always trust what you have learned. Small details matter more than people realize." The young waitress thanked her without knowing how deeply those words had already changed countless lives. As the evening sun filled the restaurant with warm golden light, Jonathan stood near the entrance watching Emily disappear into the crowd of ordinary people. She had never asked for recognition. She had never expected opportunity. She had simply refused to ignore a quiet detail everyone else overlooked. Jonathan understood that true leadership had never arrived the day he invited her into his foundation. It had already existed the moment she chose responsibility over comfort while wearing a simple waitress apron. Sometimes the world changes because extraordinary people take action, and sometimes it changes because an ordinary person quietly notices what everyone else is too busy to see.